Where?
It looks like a lion.
No, looks like a tiger.
I think it is a bear.
Nope. I'm a combination lion, tiger, and bear.
Oh, my.
If I had a nickel for every time I heard that.
The great Oz has spoken. Oh. Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.
Hello and welcome to Geekcaster Radio. This is episode 48. I am one of your hosts, TFG and Mike, and joining me is Movie Revolt Dan. Hello.
Hello. How are you?
Pretty good, pretty good. And the fantastical Optimus Solo. Hello.
I like that.
Yeah, there you go. It's better than Only the Lonely from last week, so.
The one and only.
No, Only the Lonely.
No. We should edit that to make it one and only.
Only the Lonely.
Okay.
I already put in one edit mark in episode 47. I'm not doing any more than that.
I know it's asking a lot.
I know, right? Actually, it's funny. I had my Canadian clip monkey get all the clips for episode 47 because I didn't feel like doing it. But no, JT from Saskatoon did amazing work with those clips.
You can't function without you, JT.
That's right. Apparently not. But no, we are here to count down the GCRN top 10 fantasy films. Why don't you spring the list on us there?
Oh, yeah. That would be helpful.
Yeah, that would be very helpful. Yeah, tard.
All right, there you go. It's in your window. Just giving you guys a second to look this over. Fantasy will be interesting here. I was definitely interested to see, because there's so many different subgenres within fantasy world. There's so many different franchises. There's so many different things that some people either hate or love. I was really interested to see how this was going to play out and what kind of a cross section we were going to get of fantasy overall. I do think we have a decent cross section, as we will reveal as we go through this list here, and also, as we've been going through all of the lists, it's interesting to see with franchises or whatnot how they either take away from each other or eliminate each other, this, that, and the other. But we'll try to not say too much about too many sequels or prequels or trilogies or anything to try not to give away what's coming up on our list. But yeah, it was definitely not as much agreement on this list as we had with our gangster list last episode. Last episode we had 6 films that were on every single person's list. This time we have 0. Not a single movie was listed on every single person's list, and that kind of is what I'm talking about. Like, there's just some things within the fantasy genre that certain people just do not like. It's a polarizing genre, I think, in a way, which I kind of didn't realize as much up to this point. But doing this list kind of made me see that a little bit. So, seeing the honorable mentions and trying not to give away anything as far as what you think may or may not come on the list later, what jumps out at you first, Mike?
Well, reading the list as you were giving your spiel there were several times in my head I kept saying, blasphemy, blasphemy! And again, I will reiterate that it's not fair of me to put a movie on my list that either I've never seen or I just don't care about. It's not that I hate a movie, it's just I don't care. And it doesn't it didn't feel like to me that it should have made my list.
I want to give a disclaimer out before we go too much further here. Because, doing these different genres and doing the 10 genres that we've picked out and listing our 10 movies, et cetera, there's going to be at least one film that has been victim of the fact that it's hard to, at least for me, to determine what genre it fits in. Mm-hmm. And it's going to end up not making, my guess is it ends up not making any of our top 10 lists. And I don't want it to make it seem like we don't like this film, whereas geeks, we don't appreciate this film. But Jurassic Park is just a hard one to categorize. I know most websites list it as a science fiction film. I don't see it as science fiction whatsoever.
It's not. It isn't science fiction. It's fantasy, because
every website lists it science fiction, though. IMDb,
every single website
Tomatoes.
Wrong.
I'm just saying it's one of those films that's like it's almost its own genre.
See, I agree that it is science fiction, because in fantasy, I think you're basing something that cannot be attainable. It's magic. It's something that is not humanly possible. Yes, Jurassic Park in all its glory is not humanly possible, but at least they base their plot upon science. I mean, it's really light science fiction,
It's
but
it's a plot based on science, but the whole aspect of a park of live dinosaurs, that's a complete fantasy.
well, I mean, so you could say the same thing about Star Wars. You know, like the idea of the Force is a complete fantasy. Like, but when you're, I
Well,
think fantasy, I think some sort of magical element or some sort of something you can't explain, basically. For if anything, like you can almost say Jurassic Park is more action than it is anything else, or thriller. It is that it's that genre bender that kind of can get placed.
It's
Yeah.
almost like Indiana Jones in a way. I mean, I know we came to an agreement with Indiana Jones, and it is kind of, the action, especially if you say action adventure, then it really fits. But if you just think straight action, sometimes you don't think of that. I guess for me, I mean, I understand why people are saying it's science fiction, but that's not how I view. Like in my mind, when I say science fiction, I never would think Jurassic Park. You know what I mean? You think Star Trek, you think Star Wars, you think Terminator, you think, stuff that has to do with time travel or space or, all these different things. And it's like Jurassic Park, I don't know, it's a weird one.
And I've only ever seen the first film, and I've only ever seen it as a kid. I've never gone back to that film. By the time that movie came out, I was on the end of my dinosaur fascination. So, no, seriously, it's like nowadays the only dinosaurs I care about are robotic in comics and on Cybertron.
All right.
Which other ones bounce out at you, Mike?
Dragonheart. I cannot believe Dragonheart did not make the list at all. What the hell? That movie is so awesome. That movie is the epitome of fantasy.
I've never seen it.
I'm not a fan. I'm not gonna lie.
Only 2 people voted for it.
You would like it, Kevin. I think. Have you seen any Dennis Quaid movies?
Well, I mean, I've seen movies that have
Do you
Dennis
like
Quaid in them.
any Dennis Quaid movies? Do you like him as an actor?
Yeah, I like Dennis Quaid.
Okay, so it has Dennis Quaid and it has Dennis Quaid and James Bond as the voice of a dragon.
I mean, I know what it is. I mean, I'm aware of it. I've just never seen it all the way through. And
Yeah. Another one that pops out. I'm not too shocked that it didn't make the list, but Masters of the Universe. Let's face it, it's a fourth world movie. It has it's Masters of the Universe in name only.
nonsense.
The content.
I was surprised it got as much votes as it did. I mean, it's just
but the director himself said he was going about doing the film as a Jack Kirby fourth world story. And sure, it has Skeletor. Sure, it has He-Man. Sure, it has the Sorceress. It has some version of Man-at-Arms and Tila. It has Grace.
fantasy.
Yeah. Let's see. What else? Mortal Kombat. I'm surprised that didn't make it, honestly. I know a lot of people that like Mortal Kombat.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like some of these other lists. Yeah, you see these things and you're like, oh, how did that make it and how did that not make it? But then I think when you see the list, sometimes it solidifies why there wasn't room for it. I know you're going to disagree with our list today, but because you have a lot of fantasy hate.
Well, it's not okay. Oh no! I know exactly what you're talking. I'm not gonna say it, but I know exactly.
I'm just saying that there are certain franchises.
I'm gonna go on mute a lot of times in this episode. That's what it's gonna be.
Well, I mean, I would say probably 3 or 4 of the biggest fantasy franchises in our history. You hate all of them, so that could only be expected.
Well, The Hobbit didn't make it, thank God. But no, the other ones that I'm kind of surprised didn't make it. The original Blade movie from 1998. I'm surprised that didn't at least make number 9 or number 10.
I think I'm one of the only people that likes. Well, I shouldn't say that. I really do like Blade, and I like Blade Trinity as well.
Blade 2 is just too strange to me. It was too weird for me. Blade 2 is kind of like Dan's gonna hate this. Blade 2 for me is like Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. It implores way too many of the horror genre type things.
I mean, it's directed by Del Toro, so I'm not really surprised. To me, Blade 2 I like all the Blade films, but I think Blade 2 I enjoy that the most because I think it has the best action. I think it has the best characters. I love, like, Del Toro is pretty notorious with his, like, vampire design, and you can kind of see it there. So yeah, I didn't vote for any of the Blade films. I guess they don't speak fantasy to me either. I guess when I think I I don't know. They're hard to quantify as well because you can almost say, are they more horror than they are fantasy because they're vampires? But I don't know.
I do want to also put a disclaimer out there that if anyone hears stuff banging in the background or stuff going off, I think there's multiple. I know, Mike, you, and now I'm here in my neck of the woods too. People are like setting stuff off in the back.
We are recording this July 3rd, 2013. Independence Day is July fucking 4th.
I shouldn't have said anything. But I'm just saying, if you hear stuff, that's because...
Oh, God, I hate these fucking hillbillies in this fucking town.
All right.
Other ones that... really, those are the only ones that really kind of pop out to me. I'm kind of shocked, but at the same time not shocked that neither one of the Night at the Museums made it, or neither one of the Tomb Raiders made it. Honestly, I like the Tomb Raider films. Simply because it's Angelina Jolie in short shorts. But anyway, I'm so happy Sleepy Hollow did not make it. I hate that friggin' movie. Oh, God.
The two biggest ones for me, and the two that I would have liked to see represented somewhere in some way in the top 10. Really, I have no problem with any of the other films that didn't make it. I mean, yeah, there's some classic fantasy type things with like Clash of the Titans and Excalibur, some of the ones you mentioned. That I do think of when I think of fantasy, but I understand, and I wouldn't put them in the top 10. But the two I have the biggest problem with myself, and one just because I have a soft spot for this whole franchise, and I grew up with a different version, but I also really appreciate the newer movies, is the Narnia series. And Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe came up just a bit short. I thought that was a good movie, well done. I really like the BBC, I think is who the original movie was done. Really like that version. I thought it was a credible version. So I would have liked to see Narnia somehow represented, because that is big time fantasy in a way. But the one I have the biggest problem with is the Dark Crystal. And Dark Crystal was like less than 10 points away from making our list, and that just is fantasy like personified. And
I've heard about it. I've seen posters about it, but I've never actually seen the movie. I don't dislike it. I've never seen it. So
it was on three people's list only. This list was compiled by 6 of the main people here that have collaborated throughout the whole thing, and it made it on half the list. I wish there would have been a little bit more love for Dark Crystal. I had that in my top 5. When I think of fantasy, that's one of the first things I think of, and so I was a little upset that didn't get a little more credit. But those are the main two that I had an issue with. Dan, which ones do you have issues with?
I guess I'll start with the one that looks like is the closest to make it, which is the Prestige. I love that film a lot. I know it kind of gets overlooked a bunch because it kind of came in between the Dark Knight trilogy and Inception kind of overshadowed it, but I really think that's a really solid movie. And I guess too, on the surface level, may not seem like a fantasy, but it really
that's why I didn't vote for it strictly because I don't see it as a fantasy.
Yeah, I guess it's very light on the fantasy, and it kind of reserves. It's almost saying it's a fantasy is almost a spoiler, so I don't want to say too much, but I do like that movie a lot. One movie that's 100% a fantasy is Pan's Labyrinth. I love that movie a lot. It's again, I talked about Del Toro. That's probably, to me, I think it's still his best movie. He can make really creepy creatures, but it's like this adult fairy tale. And if you haven't seen it, I would 100% advise seeing it. It's one of the better films that's probably I've seen in a very long time. You mentioned Dark Crystal. I did vote for Dark Crystal. I'm right there with you. It's one of those fantasy films like I grew up on. I remember being kind of freaked out by it by a kid because of some of the puppetry, and some of that is really creepy. But it's kind of what the charm of the 80s. 80s has some really great fantasy films, and they all have their weird little quirks. And probably the best example of that is Dark Crystal.
Right.
It looks like some of the Harry Potter movies didn't make it. Deathly Hallows, Prisoner of Azkaban. Looks like Philosopher's Stone as well. I know, Mike, you were not a big fan of Harry Potter, but I do enjoy the Harry Potter movies. I've not read all the books, but I've enjoyed the films, especially Prisoner of Azkaban and Deathly Hallows, the second one. And I think, too, that's probably that whole franchise aspect where it's hard to vote for which one. There's 8 movies.
Yeah, there's so many to choose from. I did vote for Deathly Hallows, Part 2. I thought that was my favorite out of the group. I have seen all of them. I saw all of them on either DVD or in the theater or whatnot, and I think it's a good franchise. It doesn't do as much for me as some of the other fantasy franchises, but I do think that they obviously have a major impact on the fantasy genre overall. But yeah, I think you're right. You hit that one right in the head. There's just so many films. Like, how do you break it down and pick your favorite? And especially with, it's not like a trilogy where a lot of people like the third one, or a lot of people like the first one. Like, this is 8 films, and everybody has a different favorite one.
Yeah, and I know a lot of people tend to go to Azkaban. I usually do too, but just because that's when I think that really huge shift happened. Like, the difference between 2 and 3 is astronomical compared to the other films. But other ones that kind of jump out, see The Mummy. I didn't vote for it, but I'm surprised it didn't get a little bit more love. You mentioned Narnia. I voted for that as well. I grew up with that book. Huge fan of it. I think some people, for some reason, think Narnia is like a copy of Lord of the Rings, but really that book was written before Lord of the Rings. So I think people just have a misconception there, and it is kind of a family film too. So maybe people kind of write it off, but I think it's one of the really well written books by C.S. Lewis, and
I think those films might not have came out at the best time.
Yeah,
I don't think the strategy was right for the month and the year that those came out, but I don't know.
The first one did amazing. Like, it was huge. It was really strong. The Chris Caspian didn't do as strong. I think too that one's a little darker, and I think that didn't have like a lot of families behind it like the first one did. And then the third one is not really good at all. And the third one's kind of a hard really movie to sell, because with Narnia you're losing some of your characters each time, and you've noticed like the franchises, you need those kind of characters that stay throughout it, and Narnia doesn't really have that.
You mentioned Narnia. That is the only one of our honorable mentions that made it on 4 out of the 6 lists. So it was the most voted on film to not make our top 10.
And I guess the only other one I want to touch upon is Where the Wild Things Are, which is a movie I disliked the first time I saw it. I think I was just kind of surprised by how slow it was, and I was not expecting that. But the more I've watched it, the more I've really appreciated it. And also with Gandolfini passing away, he gives a really great voice acting performance in that. Really, it's kind of shows you how much range he really has. But that's really all that kind of jumps out to me.
I just wanted to mention the other ones that were named to at least half of the lists. The honorable mentions that made at least half of our list would have been first off, Blade Trinity, Sleepy Hollow, Mortal Kombat, Harry Potter and Deathly Hallows, Excalibur, Masters of the Universe, Dark Crystal, and Night at the Museum. So those were all on at least half of the list.
All right. Well, we're going to take a quick break. You're going to hear some interesting audio from these honorable mentions, and we'll come back to start the countdown after this.
I've been alive for 4.5 centuries, and I cannot die.
Well, everybody's got their problems. What are you going to do with that?
Take it. I am Conor MacLeod of the Clan MacLeod. I was born in 1518 in the village of Glenfinnan on the shores of Loch Shiel. And I am immortal.
Conan, what is best in life? To crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and to hear the lamentation of your women. That is good. What's happening out there? You shall not pass!
All right, let's get straight to the countdown. Lead away.
Righty then. And as I'm going to keep track too as we go through here, because Dan mentioned that the 80s had a lot of good fantasy. So we'll see what decade comes out with the most mentions in our top 10. We're going to start out in the year 2002. So not in the 80s. We're starting in the year 2002 for one that Mike will appreciate here, The Lord of the Rings, Two Towers.
You guys can take it. I'll be back at number 9.
This
So
kind of
go ahead.
has me a little bit worried not worried, I should say, but if Two Towers is number 10, which I think is probably still a good film, but of all the Lord of the Rings, probably the weakest, I would say. Not, I mean, it's the weakest among a really strong trilogy. But I mean, I love Lord of the Rings. I named it one of the best trilogies of all time, if not probably the best trilogy. I think with the Two Towers, it's that middle film. You know, it's a big setup to the third film. You see that a lot with trilogies. I do like some of the aspects of it, like, you know, Gandalf and his evolution. The battles of Helm's Deep is probably one of the best action sequences in that franchise. But I'm relatively surprised to see that made the top 10. I thought other two would make it, but I'm guessing we may see those down the line as well.
Yeah, you know, I love all the Lord of the Rings movies. I don't know what Mike's malfunction is with that, but
I just don't care. I just do not care about people with giant feet, midgets with giant feet in a friggin' woods. I would rather watch a space battle.
Have you seen the films?
Yes.
All of them?
The first one. And I just don't. It's not my taste whatsoever. I'd rather see.
You're just not a fantasy fan overall.
Certain
not your favorite genre.
Certain films, but yeah, no, I would rather watch Han come in and there you go, kid, take it, blow this thing, and we can go home.
Two Towers was nominated for AFI's 100 Years, 100 Movies. It didn't make the list, but it was nominated. It also got the 85th Best Movie Quote with My Precious. Reception, you know, pretty good, as it is with all of the Lord of the Rings films. Holds a 96% on Rotten Tomatoes. 88 out of 100 on Metacritic. It's a real good film, and I have no problem with the Lord of the Rings being represented on this list, because honestly, when you think fantasy, if Lord of the Rings isn't one of the first things you think of, you're not a fan of the genre. It is fantasy done just about, I'm not saying perfectly, but it is fantasy done the right way, that's for sure. So yeah, I mean, it's not my favorite out of the three. Like Dan said, it's if I had to rank them, this would be the third one. So that it comes in at number 10, I guess we'll have to wait and see. But that is starting off. So we have one in the 2000s as far as the decades go. And now we are going to kind of follow suit with what Dan was saying before, and we're going to go to the 80s for our number 9th pick. And maybe Mike will have something to say about this one. For our number 9th pick, we're going to 1982. And we're going to talk a little bit about Arnold in Conan the Barbarian.
Never seen it.
You are definitely not a fan of this genre. Why do we have you on this record? I'm just kidding.
Because I'm the one that edits this shit.
Oh my. Dan, start us off with Conan.
All right, well, Conan. Well, the movie that kind of made Arnold into, I guess maybe a huge star, but it's really where he became more than just a guy in the background that looked big. It's people. I forgot how really solid that movie is. I think it's the sequel kind of made people forget how good the first one actually is. I mean, you have the beginning that's narrated by James Earl Jones, so you have your little bit of a Star Wars connection there, Mike, for you. So maybe it'll start off on the right foot. And Arnold is fantastic. I mean, he is Arnold. I think he is a barbarian. He looks like a barbarian, and it's the perfect role for him. And of all the Conan the Barbarian movies, all the spin-offs, this is probably the only one. Don't watch the remake. That one's pretty horrible. It is great, like sand your sand and castle type of adventure. Great actions, great swordplay, some crazy characters. So I'm very happy that it made the list.
Yeah, it's definitely a prototypical fantasy film here. In the 80s, just classic 80s stuff right here. It was nominated for its 100 Years of Film Scores for AFI. It was nominated as one of AFI's top 10 fantasy films. And its protagonist was nominated for AFI's 100 Heroes and 100 Villains. So it did have some acclaim there. You got to have Arnold in fantasy somewhere, so this is a fine spot for him. This was Birdman Dodd's number 2 pick overall, so he'll be happy that it's coming in here. Maybe not happy that it's the number 9 spot on our list, but should be happy that it's there at all. I haven't seen this film in its entirety in a while, but I do remember seeing it when I was a kid and being entertained by it. I like Dan said, I wouldn't see anything else that has anything related to Conan in the title. But this was a good one. So I have no problem with some old school 80s fantasy being represented here. And eventually we're going to get to something that maybe Mike's even seen. I don't know. We are going to stay though. Go ahead.
And it is streaming on Netflix, Mike. So you might actually like this one. There's no hobbits with hairy feet, just Arnold with a hairy chest. So maybe you'll be okay with it.
Yeah, I'll stick with Terminator.
Oh Lord, you like He-Man, but you don't like Lord of the Rings or Conan. All right. Into our number 8 spot, we're going to stay in the 80s. Stuck in the 80s. This time 1986. And I love this. I love this whole franchise, actually. 1986 fantasy film we're talking about in our number 8 spot is Highlander. Christopher Lambert, Sean Connery, Clancy Brown. The age-old battle between immortal warriors and all the mortals. I like Highlander. I like the premise of it. I liked the TV shows. I like the films. I mean, it's not my favorite franchise, but I definitely like the whole concept behind this. So I'm happy that it made us. I thought some of the 80s ones would like cancel each other out, like a Conan and a Highlander, and some of these films might cancel each other out, but I'm kind of happy that we have a couple represented here. It only has a 67% on Rotten Tomatoes. I understand that. I don't expect going forward that fantasy films, sci-fi, superhero films, that they'll all have. Well, superheroes sometimes do, but sci-fi and fantasy films sometimes get kind of crapped on when it comes to, ratings and reviews and stuff like that.
I just want to clarify something here first. The fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes is 0% to 100%, right?
Right.
It's 60%.
Well, 60% and above is considered fresh.
Right, that's what I'm saying. So
since it got 67, if it would have been 57%, it would have been a 57% rotten rating.
Rotten, right? But that's what I'm saying. It's like it's not like saying it's a D minus.
No.
So
no, but I mean it's not a super high rating, but like we've seen year after year after year with the Academy Awards and whatnot. Fantasy and sci-fi are like the forgotten stepchildren of the movie world sometimes, even though they do the most money usually. Dan, any thoughts on Highlander?
I think the first thing that kind of got me into Highlander was the TV show.
Yeah.
And then I think I went back to watch the movies. So I didn't vote for it. I like Highlander. I don't hold it as a high regard as a lot of people. I mean, that franchise kind of is one that just keeps on going. But I like you said, I do. The concept is pretty cool. The idea of being immortal, cutting off each other's heads, gaining each other's powers, and those great scenes of them with all the lightning and all the fanfare. And I believe Sean Connery's in Highlander. Am I incorrect? It's been a while since I watched it. Yeah. And so yeah, I do enjoy it. I mean, with fantasy, you tend to get a lot of great sword battles, and Highlander kind of is a lot about sword battles. When you have to chop each other's heads off. So
definitely,
it's good. It's a good fun film, and it is kind of good example of kind of the crazy concepts of the 1980s. So,
and the reason it's mainly on our list here, I mean, 4 people did vote on it, but the main reason it's up as high as it is because this was JT's number 1 pick. JT must be a big Highlander fan. I have no problem with that. So,
and Highlander is probably one of the only ones that is probably going to be on the list, except maybe the higher ups. If we travel down a certain yellow brick road, but Highlander, the series, the films, even though some of the films, like pretty much after the first one, they kind of go downhill, they kind of get into a bunch of plot holes and everything else. I think honestly, the first film I'd ever seen was not first film ever, but the first Highlander film I'd ever seen was the second one. And I had gone back and watched the first one, and I like it, I enjoy it, but it's not something I'm going to go back to today. It's kind of like you last week, Kev, when you said you watched Pulp Fiction once and you're perfectly fine with that. I'm perfectly fine with watching the Highlander films once and just never looking back.
I don't know if I'd want to see all of them again, but I definitely want to go back and watch the first one again for some reason.
Yeah.
All right, so that is our number 8 on our list, and for our number 7, we are going to have our third entry from the 80s. Again, I keep hoping that we'll get one that Mike really knows something about here. So for our third one, we're going to stay in 1986, actually, the same year that Highlander came out. And this one is for the fantasy film Labyrinth. Little Jim Henson here, little George Lucas here, and a little David Bowie.
I've never been a David Bowie fan.
This is To me, Dark Crystal is superior compared to Labyrinth, and I would have rather had Dark Crystal in this spot than the Labyrinth. I've never been a big Labyrinth fan, but four of you were, including you, Mike. So I'll let Mike and Dan take this one because I really am not a huge fan of this film.
It's been a long ass time since I've seen this, but I think it was only because of Jim Henson's name was attached to it that I had originally even seen it. But I don't know, Dan. You take it because I'm gonna have to give myself a refresher here.
Okay. I think the reason like Labyrinth was when I grew up as a kid. I can't really argue that it's not that Dark Crystal is not a better movie because I think it is, especially considering it's like all puppets and kind of Labyrinth brings in some humans. I think as a kid, honestly, growing up and liking it was because Sarah, who was Jennifer Connelly was in it. So as a kid, as a young boy, I'm gonna be far more attracted to her than a puppet. I know some people go different ways, but it's a Jim Henson creepy creations that for some reason should not be shown to kids, but somehow work. It's like they're obviously on drugs, on a lot of drugs, probably some good drugs. I don't know. I don't do that, but
it was the 80s.
Yeah, it was it's 80s, post 70s, but Jim Henson is able to do, and just the creations and the crazy puppetry and the worlds he creates it's a great staple of the 1980s and just what people were doing. You can't really make a movie like that today. But again, it's one of the movies that I just grew up as a kid, and you could argue probably they're better films, but I'm not gonna lie, it's very much a nostalgia pick for me.
I feel like I'm in the middle of a war zone. JT, I find it kind of interesting that the people that did ranked it all very similar. JT had it at the 7th spot. Mike, Birdman and TFG1 both had it in the 9th spot, and then you had it in the 12th spot. So everybody kind of had it in one of those middle of the road categories that voted on it. Steve and I didn't vote for it. So I guess since you guys all had it in the 7 to 10 spot, that I guess number 8 isn't that bad.
Plus you got basically Frank Oz reprising Yoda as the wise man.
I'll give you that, I guess. Any other thoughts on Labyrinth, Mike?
Nah.
Okay. Then I guess we'll head to our number 6 film, and we will leave the 80s for the first time since number 10 here. And we'll go to 1990 for our number 6 film, and I'm very happy that this one made the list at least somewhere, and that is for the film, maybe one of the only Tim Burton films I really, really like, and that is Edward Scissorhands.
Now this I like. It's probably the only Johnny Depp film I can actually watch.
Oh, I like Johnny Depp a lot, but...
No. Okay. But you gotta understand, though, for me, like, watching this as a kid, this was the one Johnny Depp film I knew about as a kid, and then, he started, going all swallow type stuff and pirates this, and Johnny Depp nowadays is like, I just don't give a fuck about the guy's acting. I don't give a fuck about his acting. I don't. Every time I see Johnny Depp's name, it's on a Tim Burton film. It's like their goal in life after Scissorhands was, we have to do every film together. That's it. But Johnny Depp back then was just amazing. Edward Scissorhands is one of the best films of all time, in my opinion.
And we got Alan Arkin, Vincent Price, Anthony Michael Hall, Winona Ryder. Interesting cast here put together. Interesting concept. I just remember seeing this in 1990. I probably actually didn't see it until late 1990 or 91. I saw it like as soon as it was released. Well, it was probably 91 since it came out late 90. I saw it at some point in 91, and after it was either the first time it was released on video or it was the first time it aired on TV or something. And I was at a friend's house and we watched it, their whole family, and I was invited to watch it with them. And I just remember thinking this was so like bizarre yet interesting and unique and just something I'd never seen before. And I didn't really even know who Johnny Depp was at that point, so it wasn't like I was basing anything about the movie on him, and I just thought it was an amazing film that was just like something I'd never seen before at all. So I'm very happy that it's on the list. It's definitely fits the genre, and I think it definitely deserves top 10. What do you think, Dan?
Well, before Dan goes, really quickly, we have a Law and Order connection here, Kev. Diane West Peg Boggs is one of the DAs from Law and Order Prime.
Gotcha.
Nora something or other. I forget what the DA's name was.
But the only people that did not vote for this were Steve and Birdman.
Yeah, well, Birdman's Canadian. We can forgive that.
You say that once a show. You know that, right?
Yes, I know.
I think with Edward Scissorhands, like Tim Burton's been chasing this film. Well, I guess maybe not. He's been chasing it a lot of times. I think he's been trying to recreate it in different areas, like Alice in Wonderland. He's been trying to get that dark fantasy, Sleepy Hollow. You can even say like that dark fairy tale that works. It's kind of unique, and I think why this one works is because it's unlike anything else. He's not retelling someone else's tale. He's creating his own. Like Johnny Depp, I think, was still kind of he could still mold. He was still young. He was still kind of green, and I think his stick wasn't as tiresome as it can get at times. But it works for this, and like you mentioned, it's unlike anything really that's out there. And I just I remember the colors just of the town and that the differences between the dark and black Johnny Depp with like the neon colors of all the different houses and kind of this crazy version of suburbia and the love of Tupperware, and it's an odd film, but it's oddly charming and it really works. And I kind of wish Tim Burton would get back to doing things like this because it has that dark edge to it, but it's still I would consider in a lot of ways like a family film. I remember watching this as a kid. I don't think as a kid I really understood most of it, and there's something too about having the character of Edward Scissorhands. He's such a tragic figure, and you can't help but like feel bad and sympathize and relate to his plight. And two, with Winona Ryder, their chemistry was really strong, and that's when she was still giving really great performances as well. So very happy. This was high on my list as well. So
yeah, you actually got this one right on the dot. You had this on the correct spot. You had it 6th on your list, and that's where it comes in on our list. Mike, you had it 5th. I had it 9th, and JT had it 11th. So we all had it fairly high. It currently has 91% on Rotten Tomatoes. So I mean, it's a well-respected movie throughout the film world, and I'm definitely happy that it's on our list. So it's our first entry from 1990. We'll see if we have any others, and then we will move on to our top 5 here by going back to the 80s. And this time we're going to go to 1988. And I didn't think this would get as much love, but I'm happy that it did. And for 1988, we're going to go to Ron Howard's film, another George Lucas connection here, 1988's film Willow. Warwick Davis, Val Kilmer, Billy Barty. Definitely fantasy film. Sword and sorcery is all about this baby. So I'm happy. This is another film that I need to go back and rewatch. I have not seen this in a long time, but I just remember absolutely loving this film as a kid. It does only have a 46% on Rotten Tomatoes. Yeah, so like I said, sometimes these fantasy films don't get a lot of love here, but I like the film. I'm glad it's on the list. Somebody else talk about Willow a little bit.
For me, I always get this and Legend confused. I don't know why, but I haven't seen it in a long time, so that's why it didn't make my list.
Yeah, the Willow. I voted for it. I'll admit, like Willow is not it. You saying it has a 47% rating. I'm not really surprised by it. It is, in a lot of ways, it's not necessarily a great movie, but it is charming and it's fun. It has. I love Warwick Davis as the different characters. As a kid, I think this is like one of the really. It is full on fantasy, and it's kind of hard to probably dissect for some people because it has no shame. It's very earnest. It kind of like we talked about crazy characters. It has a lot of random things that necessarily don't make sense, but they kind of work. I love Warwick Davis as Willow. Val Kilmer. I think he's a lot of fun. I mean, the thing that always I'm remembered of when I think of Willow is that scene when they're like snow sledding down the hill with a shield and going through all the camp. I think that's the first thing I think of as a kid. I remember that kind of grabbed my attention because I'm thinking that's great. I want to go sledding like that. But it's been a while since I've watched it. I've been meaning to go back to it, but it was one of the first fantasy films I think that kind of I got into, and it did kind of pave the way for more and more fantasy films we have today. I mean, the special effects here aren't fantastic, but for the time, they're not bad. I mean, there are certain things that work. Certain creatures kind of are obviously not kind of not the best use of computer graphics or miniatures, but you can they have that appeal of the 80s fantasy. There's a certain kind of atmosphere with 80s fantasy films, and I think Willow is one of the best examples of it. If you want to see what 80s fantasy was like, it's probably best to check out Willow, because it's like the perfect example of what it meant to be an 80s fantasy film.
I do find it interesting that we're doing this record today, because it was actually just yesterday, July 2nd, Disney, the rights holders of Willow after its 2012 purchase of Lucasfilm, confirmed that it would be rebooting the franchise. So,
work, David needs work, so I mean...
Yeah, I mean, this has been something that's been rumored, because I remember back in early 2000s where they were talking about television series or a possible second movie, but, now that Disney has a hold of all this stuff, we could be seeing lots of different stuff getting reboots and sequels that we haven't seen before. I mean, we do live in the age of reboots and sequels, so we'll see what they do with Willow.
I think it is kind of a good film to reboot, because, like I mentioned, it's not a great film and has potential, and maybe they could do something more interesting and maybe add in a little bit more money to make the special effects a little more put together than they were.
Yeah, Birdman had this ranked number 3 on his list. JT had it ranked number 5. Dan, you had it ranked number 8. And I had it ranked number 10. So that is why it got its spot here on 4 people's lists. And that is how we open up the second half here. And I guess Mike can take a time out here, because for our number 4th film, we're going back into the decade of the 2000s. This time we're going to 2003. And the film that takes our 4th spot is Pirates of the Caribbean, The Curse of the Black Pearl. Another Johnny Depp appearance here in our fantasy countdown, and this was obviously the first of the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise. Dan, I'll let you start here with this one. What do you feel about the first Pirates of the Caribbean coming in here at our number 4 spot?
I really love the first Pirates of the Caribbean. I really wish this is a franchise that never had a sequel, because it's kind of ruined the first one in a lot of ways, because it got really unnecessarily plot, like the plot in the film kind of went everywhere, and it got crazy and unnecessarily big, and the scope got too crazy. But the first one, I think, is just right. We talked about different genres, and Pirates of the Caribbean hits a lot of different genres. It has the fantasy elements. It has even some horror moments. It has action, adventure. And this is when you talked about Johnny Depp kind of jumping the shark after Edward Scissorhands. I think he really kind of jumped the shark after this movie, because I think after this is kind of the role that he kind of went back to over and over again, and we're still seeing it today with things like The Lone Ranger. Gore Verbinski as a director, like he is interesting. He does a lot of interesting things. He can have some great set pieces that are unlike anything else, that are really highly choreographed, that are very Raiders of the Lost Ark-esque, and I think the best example of that is Pirates. Some really great characters, a lot of fun and adventure. It really is a family film that works. You can watch that with kids. You can watch it as adults. It really is a crowd pleaser. That's actually still a good movie. So
it's got 79% on Rotten Tomato. I think Roger Ebert said this really good here. I'm going to read his quote. It can be said that Depp's performance is original in its every atom. There has never been a pirate, or that, for that matter, a human being like this in any other movie. His behavior shows a lifetime of rehearsal. This movie is all about one of the most remarkable performances by an actor in a long time. And I'm not talking about, you have your dramatic roles and this and that and the other, but as far as like a fantasy role or in this type of genre, I mean, his performance is ridiculously good. That's why he's been copying bits and pieces of it, I guess, in every role since then. But
I love watching people trying to imitate him on different things.
I mean, then Lone Ranger is literally his character with just a different costume on, so I don't know what they were thinking with that. But
I don't know. Lone Ranger is out in theaters now, and honestly, I'm more interested in that film than I was about any of these.
I'm just saying, when you see the trailer, it's like, that's Jack Sparrow with a different setting. I don't know.
I just came from The Lone Ranger, actually, and I can just say surprisingly, the least offensive thing about that movie was the fact that Johnny Depp was playing a Native American. It's not a very good movie. I'll have a review of it up shortly. But I think too, with you talked about that performance and the copycats. I think that is an issue with it too. It's the same thing with like Ledger's Joker. It's like everyone has to like do that character, and you see it kind of reprised in like scary movie films because it's like an easy character to go to make fun of or to gimmick. But I think this performance, when I first saw it, it was new. It was different. It was unlike anything.
Something you'd never seen before, and it was an example of Johnny Depp's genius.
Yeah, when he hits a character right, he hits a character right, and that's one example of it for sure.
It was nominated for AFI's 100 Years, 100 Movies. It was also nominated for AFI's Top 10 Fantasy Films. Did not make either list. But definitely happy to see a Pirates movie because that is definitely a big, impactful franchise in the fantasy genre. I figured we'd see some type of Pirates film. That it's the first one that we're seeing here in this spot. Doesn't upset me at all because, like Dan said, I think that's probably the best of the bunch. Any thoughts there, Mike?
Nope.
All right. For our number 3 spot, we are going to pick a different decade here. We've had the 2000s, we've had the 80s, we've had the 90s. How about the 30s? We'll go to 1939.
What the hell could be better than this?
We're going to 1939, and the film is, of course, The Wizard of Oz.
I veto this. This needs to be number 1, not number 3.
I'm sorry, but you had your vote, and that is not how things turned out. Wizard of Oz, I had this ranked number 2 on my list. Steve did not have this on his list. Mike, you had this at number 1.
Yep. Where it's supposed to be.
JT had this at number 2. Birdman had this at number 7.
Fucking Canadians.
We did make the exception with the fantasy films that we could do anything in any decade. Usually we've had a cutoff about 1970, but since there wasn't a lot of fantasy films before that, we kind of opened it up a little bit. And then let me just tell you that the voting between these top 4 is really, really close. They're all within 10 votes, starting there with the Pirates of the Caribbean, number 1, that last spot, and now with the Wizard of Oz. They were all very close, but Wizard of Oz comes in at number 3. Obviously, it has a lot of acclaim. Obviously, it has a lot of history. Get that out of the way as far as some of the AFI-related things. It's going to take a second, but it is ranked number 6 on AFI's 100 Years, 100 Movies, which I don't understand then how it's ranked number 43 on AFI's 100 Years, 100 Thrills, but somebody may be able to explain that to me at some point.
Maybe it wasn't as thrilling for the AFI people. Or maybe the AFI people are just like the MMPA people, a bunch of old codgers behind a screen.
For 100 Heroes and 100 Villains, it had the number 4 villain there with Wicked Witch of the West. AFI's 100 Years, 100 Songs, If I Only Had a Brain got nominated. Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead came in at number 82. And Over the Rainbow was actually their number 1 selection for movie songs. For quotes, it had Pay No Attention to That Man Behind the Curtain was nominated. Melting, What a World was nominated. Lions and Tigers and Bears, Oh My was nominated. I'll Get You, My Pretty and Your Little Dog 2 was number 99. There's No Place Like Home was number 23. And Toto, I Have a Feeling We're Not in Kansas Anymore was number 4. So definitely has some notable quotes. For scores, it was nominated for its score for 100 Years of Musicals that came in at number 3. 100 Years, 100 Cheers, number 26. The 10th Anniversary, 100 Years, 100 Movies, number 10. And AFI's Top 10 Fantasy Films that came in at number 1. So, Dan, thoughts on Wizard of Oz?
It's easily one of the best movies of all time. There's really no question about that. I mean, it encapsulates like everything that's magical about movies. I think it really pushed the genre forward to a new heights. I mean, when it came out in 1939, just the color, the Technicolor, just the presentation. I think it is responsible, I think, for a huge aspect of where movies are today. It's so such a huge staple within our culture. I mean, everything has parodied it. Yes, it's based off a book, but I don't think anyone would know the story without the movie. The book was popular, but not nearly as popular as the movie, and the movie is completely different than the book. It's not nearly as political as the novel. Great. It's. I think if you don't watch this as a child, your parents probably should be, arrested for child abuse, because it's. I think I remember as a kid kind of being freaked out by the Wicked Witch, but I think that's kind of a good thing in a way. I don't know. It's hard to say. It's one of those movies like The Godfather. It's just The Wizard of Oz. Everything that's been said about it probably has been said about it. It's just, it's amazing. It's great songs, great characters. If you have not seen The Wizard of Oz, you stop and go see it.
Stop listening and go see it. It's got a 99% Rotten Tomatoes. 94 of the 95 critics gave it a positive review, so only one person gave it a negative review. Mike, you had this at number 1.
Oh yeah, this film is absolutely amazing. From the Munchkins to the whole, Twister falling on the evil Wicked Witch of the East, and
that witch is one of the creepiest characters in film history.
The Wicked Witch of the East, all we saw was her feet.
No, I'm sorry, I meant the Wicked Witch of the West.
Yeah, Wicked Witch of the West is one of the creepiest characters in film history. I agree with that, and it was good old-fashioned film fun. It really was. I mean, yes, the Wicked Witch was creepy, but that was the point of it. I actually found the friggin' monkeys more creepy
That's true.
than the witch.
My sister did as well.
But no, I really enjoy the film. I can go back every now and then and watch it again. All the songs, all the quotes. Why is it every time that I see her uncle, I don't remember. It's her uncle, another guy, the wizard, and then Auntie M, right? It's 4 people that she wakes up to, correct? Or is it 5? I always think that there's 2 other guys besides the aunt and uncle and the wizard. I always think that there's 3 males inside the bedroom when she wakes up, because I keep thinking Mo, Larry, Curly when she wakes up to those 3 guys. But no, I love this film. It's absolutely great. I love what they've done over the years with some of the adaptations. I have not seen
It's
Wicked.
got to be one of the most reinterpreted films in so many different versions that I've ever seen. You have the Muppets, Wizard of Oz there. You got just recently, with Oz the Great and Powerful.
Oz the Great and Powerful.
You have the new Dorothy animated film. I think that's coming out this year unless it gets pushed back again.
Get the Wiz.
The Wiz. Yeah, the Wiz.
The Wiz.
Wicked, like you said, as far as Broadway goes.
I would love to go see Wicked.
That's actually number 1 on my list of things I would like to see on Broadway.
Yeah, because that is the story of the witches.
And the music for that is ridiculously good.
Yeah, I've heard it, I've seen it, but I have not seen the actual play in person. I will say one of the worst things to ever come out of reimagining this story or this franchise is the sequel to this movie, Return to Oz. Oh my god, that movie is so creepy, so bad, just such horrible, horrible things. Basically what happens in that is that she goes back to Oz, and it's basically a dystopian Oz. There's nothing, it's not beautiful and majestic as it was in the original, in the original movie. And that movie just freaked me out as a kid.
One of the best interpretations of Oz besides the movie is actually the comic books that Marvel. I don't know if Marvel put it out or they just distributed them, but they're really great as well. They follow the book more than the movie and the book series, which is, like I mentioned, different. But that artwork and that is great. So if you're a fan of Wizard of Oz, I would definitely advise checking those out.
This thing just hit on so many things that you need for a successful, specifically successful fantasy film. Number 1, it took us to a world that was completely different. Almost like Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory or something like that. Like, we were just transported into this world that was just amazing. So you have that going for it. You have super memorable characters. With very distinct personalities and looks and stuff like that, which is huge. Then you add all kinds of quotable lines for dialogue, and then some great songs and musical scores behind it. So I mean, there's really not much that they did wrong with this film. They hit on all cylinders.
Do you mind if I run down some of the comic stuff really quick?
Go for it.
MGM's Marvelous Wizard of Oz was the first joint publishing venture between DC Comics and Marvel Comics. One of the issues of the Classics Illustrated Junior was a condensed version of The Wizard of Oz. The comic book series Oz Squad featured an adult Dorothy and her original companions from The Wonderful Wizard of Oz and a covert operations group protecting Oz from threats from both within its borders and from the real world. Wow.
Those aren't the ones I'm talking about.
Are you talking about Marvel Fairy Tales?
I don't know what it's based off of, but they recently came out. I can look it up and we can talk about it later. I'm looking it up now.
Yeah. I think it's Marvel Fairy Tales.
Then there was Tom and Jerry's Wizard of Oz last year.
Yeah.
Or a couple years ago.
There was also, you mentioned Muppet Wizard of Oz, but there was, Phineas and Ferb did one, The Wizard of Odd. That was really interesting.
Yeah. And then there was the other Broadway play that was actually The Wizard of Oz. Not Wicked, a different one with Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice. So there's just been a crap ton of reinterpretations of things, not necessarily sequels, but just other ways that this has popped up in the culture over the years. And like Dan said, they've gone way far away from the original political meaning behind and reasoning for this whole story. That's definitely been lost over the years, but definitely a fun little fantasy film.
Sorry, I just found it. The one I'm talking about is The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, which is written by Eric Shinower and the art's done by Scotty Young. That's the one I'm talking about, which is it's great. It's kind of the funky little art style that works with the characters, and the lion more looks like a real lion. But yeah, definitely check that out if you're a fan of the movie.
And if you're a gamer like Birdman Dot is, I think the best video game of the franchise that it had was The Wizard of Oz, a 1993 Super Nintendo video game based on the 1939 film. So there you go for gaming.
All right. Any other thoughts on Wizard of Oz before we move on?
Number one.
Before we move on to the top two.
Should have been number one.
Obviously, since you ranked it number one, but you were the only person that did rank it number one, so everybody else had something else in the top spot. One of which we're going to talk about right here in our number two spot. We're going to leave the 30s. Surprise, we only had one entry from the 30s. We're going to go back to the 2000s. And this time for our number two film in our top 10 fantasy films of all time, we are going to go to the year 2001 for The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring. The first Lord of the Rings film, which was number one on Dan's list. It was number 3 on my list. It was number 10 on Steve's list. It was number 7 on JT's list and number 9 on Dodd's list. It did not make an appearance on Mike's list. It is the first film that we've talked about that has been on 5 of the 6 lists. And since you had it number 1, we'll let you talk about it first. Dan, what do you think about Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring coming in at number 2 here?
Okay. Well, The Lord of the Rings as a whole, like I said, I think is probably the best trilogy of all time. And I think it's hard for me to pick the best one or my favorite. I think Fellowship of the Ring kind of just is a little bit better for me than the third one, just because I think the third one goes a little too long with the multiple endings, but that's like the only knock. I think too, what I love about the Fellowship of the Ring is just how it brings you into this world of Middle Earth. And I'm speaking as a person that never read any of the books. I still really have no desire to read any of the books, but I love the movies. I love the world they create. I remember seeing the trailer, Mike, and I was the same thing as you. I had no interest in it. I didn't even see the first one in theaters. I waited till it came out on home media, saw it on DVD, maybe even VHS at that point. I don't even know, and I loved it. I just loved the story, how we talked about Wizard of Oz, how it brings you to this world, and Lord of the Rings kind of lives in this world, and all these crazy characters. It felt like a video game at that time, but like a good video game. It had magic, it had swordplay, it had the trolls, everything was so odd and unique, and I just loved it, and I really kind of ate it up, and I still love it to this day. The score, the special effects, this is one of the best movies of the 2000s, along with this whole trilogy. And I think if it wasn't for the fact that 2 more were coming out, I really think this one probably would have taken all the Oscars that year, like Lord of the Rings, Return of the King did. But I think they kind of held back because they knew more were coming. So they're kind of like, well, let's wait to the last film and then give it everything. But you really can't do wrong. I mean, I think Return of the King is probably more entertaining and has more epic battle sequences. But for me, I just love how it brings you into this world. So.
It has 92% on Rotten Tomatoes. It had nominated a hero for 100 Heroes and Villains with Gandalf the Grey. It had nominated for its score, and it was number 50 on AFI's 100 Years, 100 Movies. And for AFI's top 10 fantasy films, it came in at number 2, which is exactly where we have it. Speaking of Gandalf the Grey, they just finished filming his last ever scenes as Gandalf the Grey for what they're doing with The Hobbit. There was some news story about that and how Peter Jackson was tearing up because he was filming his last scene with Gandalf. But anyway,
that's because Ian has to go over and become one of the greatest supervillains again in Magneto. So I will say, before we move on, I will say my initial reaction to the trailer is because a year before the film came out, I had heard a whole bunch of hype about it, and I tried to go back and read the book. The first time I read Fellowship, I was 14. I didn't get it. I reread the line. I think it's on page... Whenever the book starts, like the very first couple of pages when they're talking about Bilbo's birthday, and they said 11st, and apparently 11st in this fucked up universe means he's 111 years old. At 14, I so didn't get that. At 21, I went back to try to read the book again before the movie came out, and I couldn't. I made it halfway through the book, and I'm like, yeah, where's my Hardy Boys mysteries? I want something I can actually enjoy. So I knew going in, regardless of if the films take some stuff from the book, if they don't take anything from the book, I just didn't care, and I still don't care. I don't hate the franchise. I respect it for what it's done. Now, if there's a franchise I absolutely hate, is that dumb fucking kid who thinks he's a goddamn wizard.
This is what I would say to that. Well, one, I don't know why I would hate Harry Potter, unless you're like, think it's gonna make kids evil.
Pretty much, yeah.
All right.
Kids are gonna imitate it and go into schools and do all kinds of stupid stuff and end up in jail. And
no. You could say the same thing about superhero movies. I mean, it's the same.
Well, there was that story recently about the dumb idiot in an Iron Man mask trying to rob a bank, so that's not, it's not too far-fetched.
One thing I would just try to sell you on, like I said, I never read the books, and for I know a lot of people that hold the novels to high acclaim, and I can understand why. It's a certain style, it's a certain kind of, it's like the Renaissance fair. It's not necessarily for everyone. I guess for me the movies are great even if you don't enjoy the books. I think they make it really much more easy to digest than the books do. It's not, you don't have a levity first, even if you don't understand what that means in the movie. It really doesn't matter. Like, who knows what, like, they can be talking about all strange and like whatever myth they're going into or whatever. But I think that's what makes it such a remarkable movie, is that it makes all that work even if you're not into fantasy. And if you don't like the first one that much, I would say you probably would like the second one and the third one a lot more, because they're much more action based. The pacing is a lot quicker, and it's not necessarily as slow as the first movie. So you might actually enjoy those a little bit more. So I would just say maybe give it a second try.
It doesn't mean a lot coming from me, because I always like the movie better than the book. I'm just a weird person like that, no matter how many people tell me books are better. Sure. Because for me, part of the enjoyment of the movie is how stuff is interpreted. It's how it's seeing the craft of the acting. It's seeing the costumes. It's seeing the visual effects. It's seeing all of these different facets that people work so hard to do a great job on. And with this film, all of that stuff is on point. Peter Jackson's amazing, and all the stuff they did with this film just made it so believable and so real, even though it is a fantasy film.
Has Peter Jackson done anything outside of these two franchises, Hobbit and Lord of the Rings?
Yeah, he's done. He's done some horror films in the '90s. He did King Kong. He did the Lovely Bones. Which wasn't that great. The King Kong was. I kind of like King Kong. It has some issues. It's a little bit too long at times. It makes the '88 original film into like a 2.5-hour movie. And what's it? I can't think of the movies he did earlier than that, but he really wasn't a big name until the Lord of the Rings. It's kind of what made him into such a huge star.
A lot of these directors now that get pigeonholed into these franchises, it's to me it's like George Lucas all over again. Sure, everybody remembers American Graffiti. Sure, everybody remembers THX. But when you say George Lucas, specifically to directing, Star Wars, that's really all he's done.
Well, he didn't even direct most of the Star Wars films too. I think that was more of Lucas. I could see that we do have that issue where you have directors who kind of throw themselves into franchises and trying to get out. But
the difference is George Lucas created that world. So of course that's what he's going to be known for, and that's what people are going to think of. I mean, he actually created he's not taking a book, he's not taking something else and adapting it.
Oh no, I know, but I'm just saying, like, what have you really heard about? My biggest complaint, and this is a tangent. I know, I don't care. They happen. My biggest complaint about George Lucas is that that's all he's known for, because everybody complains he constantly goes back and changes stuff, because instead of actually trying to come up with a new fucking idea and direct a new film, something different, not counting Red State, or is it Red State? Whatever the hell it's Red Tails, Red State.
He didn't direct that either. He went.
I know, but I'm just saying that he's got so caught up in his own universe that he can't step outside of it and do something new and different after he created his universe.
I mean, he did. I mean, to be fair, he did produce the Indiana Jones franchise. He did a lot of second unit directing. I think I just think he doesn't like directing because it's not something he does anymore. And I do agree. Like he has the potential to do more, and instead of just tweaking Star Wars. But again, I guess we can save that for next week because that's when we're doing the science fiction. But regarding Peter Jackson,
do you think a Star Wars film will come up in that?
I don't know. Maybe. Maybe. I don't know. I'm just people. I think people have heard of it a little bit. But Peter Jackson, he was even selected to direct the Hobbit franchise. It was supposed to be Del Toro, but he dropped out, and I think a few other people, and I think Jackson just eventually just took it up again. But I think I could see Jackson after the Hobbit's over still kind of having a career, and unlike Lucas, kind of doing new things and going different ways, because he's tried to do it. He's tried to do it with The Lovely Bones, which is nothing like the Lord of the Rings movies. They're more drama based, and King Kong, I mean, it's similar in some ways, but again, it's completely different because it's not fantasy. I don't know if you'd count that as fantasy. Maybe, I guess it's not really science fiction either. So I don't know. Genres are hard, basically, is what I'm trying to say. Yeah,
sometimes it gets a little blurry. Well, let's just keep the discussion going then as we unveil our number one pick. We're just going to go 2 years into the future here, into 2003, and that would be for Lord of the Rings, Return of the King, as our number one pick. Now, obviously, a lot of people go back and forth on whether the first one's better or the third one's better. I don't ever hear anyone say the second one's the best. I think that's pretty much widely accepted. But Lord of the Rings 3, again, on everybody's list except for Mike's, it was 11th on Dodd's list. It was 9th on JT's list. It was 4th on Dan's list. It was 3rd on Steve's list. And it was 1st on my list. Steve and I are the only ones that had Lord of the Rings, Return of the King ahead of Fellowship of the Ring. Everybody else had Fellowship ahead, just not by as much. So Return of the King, obviously that was the one that got handed all of the Oscars and basically broke the mold as far as fantasy films getting some accolades, and there was a huge deal with this winning. It did not get put on AFI's list, although it did get nominated for their 100 Years, 100 Movies. But yeah, nominated for 11 Academy Awards, won all the categories for which it was nominated. Has that ever happened?
Yeah, it tied the record. It tied it with Titanic. I don't know if anyone's ever won every single one, but it tied the record for the most.
I just meant winning everything that it's been.
I mean,
put up for.
Maybe not to that extent. Ben-Hur also won 11, and so did Titanic. And I don't know if there's anything that they were nominated for that they didn't win.
Right.
But my guess is if it had it, never to that extent. I mean, 11 out of 11. That's pretty impressive.
Second film in history to earn over $1 billion. It's fantastic. It's got 94% on Rotten Tomatoes, and that's why I just wanted to kind of quickly go into this because we're still talking about the franchise here. I don't know if there's ever been a better trilogy, 1 through 3. it's really hard to come up with something that can beat the quality that we have through these three films. I love all of them. It's very minute how I separate them, but I did put this one a little bit higher just because I just like the way that this film, the pacing of it, the action, the way they wrap things up. I just really, really like this film. I just put it slightly above the other ones, but definitely happy that Lord of the Rings is represented on our top 10. I wasn't sure that all three films would be in our top 10 as it turned out, but that is how it turned out. Dan, how do you feel about the placement here? We had Lord of the Rings 2 at our 10th spot, the first one at our second spot, and the third one here at number 1.
It's probably not the most variety, but I mean, I guess considering the fact that if you look at, I know we went back before the 1970, but considering the fact that that's probably what we know the best as a website is 1970, 1980, and beyond that, they are head and shoulders above everything else that's really come out in that genre. I mean, I do think Pan's Labyrinth is up there, but it's probably not as popular as other movies. I have no issue with it being 1 and 2. Like I said, it's really kind of the how I feel about the Lord of the Rings movies is kind of how I feel about Quentin Tarantino films. My favorite can change depending on the year. Actually, this list came out just in time because I remember I actually sat through an extended edition marathon of these films at AMC, which was a good chore. And I think that's kind of when I got to compare each one. And I think at the end, I still enjoyed Fellowship a little bit more than everything else. But have you seen the extended editions?
In college one time, we actually, it was right when they came out, and we had a marathon of all three extended versions back to back to back. And that was a long 24 hours, but a very enjoyable one at the same time. And, this was only just to give people a little bit of a idea here. Lord of the Rings, Return of the King only beat Fellowship of the Ring by 2 points. So it was definitely very close. And like I said, Wizard of Oz was just very closely behind those. We had 4 films in our top 10 from the 2000s, being the 3 Lord of the Rings and the first Pirates film. We had 4 from the 80s with Willow, Labyrinth, Highlander, and Conan. We had our 190s film with Edward Scissorhands, and obviously our old school with Wizard of Oz. Looking at the list overall, like I said, my only issue is I would have liked to see maybe Narnia represented instead of the second Lord of the Rings, possibly, and I would have rather seen Dark Crystal in the spot that Labyrinth had. Other than that, I don't really have too much of an issue. We have a little bit, like I said, we have a cross-section of a bunch of different types of fantasy, in my opinion. We do have different decades represented. Obviously, having 3 Lord of the Rings films, maybe some people would have an issue with that, but then again, it is probably the best fantasy trilogy of all time. So I don't necessarily have an issue with that. Looking at the list overall, what do you think, Dan?
I'm fine with it. It's probably the least dynamic of all the lists. It's kind of straightforward and not huge surprises. I guess there's some here and there. When I was putting together my list, it's probably the hardest one I came up with, just because there isn't a huge assortment of movies to choose from. I guess I shouldn't. There's kind of like a huge dropping off point. You have a really solid top 7 or 8, and then everything else is kind of harder to pick. I think if anything, maybe we should probably, if we're going to represent fantasy in the last 30, 40 years, maybe we should make a spot someplace for Harry Potter. But the issue is which one, because there's so many hard one to choose from.
Yeah, I was very shocked that not a single Harry Potter film broke the list. But like you said, there's so many to pick from. How do you?
Yeah, it's kind of it's difficult. I know, Mike, you're probably very happy about that, but I do like this one. I was with you, Mike, for a very long time. I was like, those movies seem kind of stupid, but anything that can get kids to read and are actually pretty solid books and very interesting and really well-made movies. So I could see some people being very upset that not one Harry Potter movie made the list, but the thing I'm
sorry to interrupt you, but I've told the story before. I'm going to tell it in a slightly different way. For me, the whole wizard thing ties into Arthur. It's Merlin. Merlin is my wizard. I don't care about any other wizards other than what had to do with the Arthurian stuff. And I've said this story before. In 2000, I believe it was, I went into a Books A Million. The lady behind the counter said, I've got 2 selections that you might be interested in. One is a boy wizard who has to save the world, and the other is a former lingerie buyer turned bounty hunter. And I'm thinking, Yeah, I'll take Stephanie Plum and her series, please. To hell with the damn wizards.
Alrighty. Well, anyways,
I just think when you think of fantasy, if you're going to think of franchises, you're going to think of Lord of the Rings, you're going to think of Pirates of the Caribbean, maybe the Chronicles of Narnia, and you're going to think of Harry Potter. Like those are the 4 franchises that, in my mind, immediately come up. I'm not saying that there's not, you might not think of like the Highlander ones or something like that, but those are the 4 that really just pop out to me. So I'm kind of surprised we didn't have a Harry Potter representation, and for all intents and purposes, we didn't have a Narnia representation either. But like I said, I guess when you're tasked with only coming up with 10, that's the type of stuff that happens. Because if we were going to have 20, we would have gotten 1 of each. We would have gotten 1 Narnia, and we would have gotten 1 Harry Potter. So.
And I think with Harry Potter too, there's no consensus on which one's the best. Like some of the franchise, like Die Hard, like everyone agrees pretty much Die Hard 1 is probably the best. But with Harry Potter, every Harry Potter fan has a different idea of what movie's the best one. So it's.
And I think that's what helped Pirates, because there was only 2 other Pirates films that got voted on, and it was only by one person. One person voted for the second film, one person voted for the 4th film. So I think it was because there was more of a consensus that the first one is the best there, that 4 people voted on it and voted on it fairly highly. Because you do think of that franchise and you think, I got to vote on at least 1 Pirates movie, and everybody seemed to pick the first one. Whereas people might have thought that for Harry Potter, but we got Deathly Hallows, and we got Prisoner of Azkaban, and we got Philosopher's Stone, and stuff like that. So I mean, it just split it up more.
Yeah, maybe if the last one stayed one movie, that would be a consensus. But the fact that they split it up to 2, I think kind of makes it even harder to choose. So I don't know, but overall, minus that whole Harry Potter thing, I think nothing really stands out as doesn't belong there. Nothing stands out as hugely shocking. Happy Lord of the Rings is on top. Happy we have Wizard of Oz, some old school representation that deserves it. So yeah, and I'm really curious about what's coming next. So
yeah, definitely, Mike. What are your overall thoughts on the list?
Have the 2 rings at 3 and 2 and put Wizard of Oz at number 1.
Then you're fine with it?
If Wizard of Oz is number 1, yeah.
You're fine with Johnny Depp being on there twice?
I don't care. As long as it wasn't Alice in fucking Wonderland. That was the worst Johnny Depp movie I've ever seen.
I think you've said that about 4 of his films before, if we were to trace back other podcasts. Anyway.
All of Johnny Depp's films, except for Edward Scissorhands, are the worst films I've ever seen.
Alrighty then. Like I said, it's about to get heated because we've had, like, Mike wasn't really exposed to Harry Potter, or Lord of the Rings, or some of these other films. I really think going into these next 2 lists that most people are going to be exposed to almost everything that's there. Maybe I'm wrong, but I have a feeling it's going to get a little bit more intense as we go to our final 2 countdowns. Just real quickly to go over AFI's listing, because we've been doing that. AFI kind of had a very broad definition of fantasy as a genre.
Did they ever on the
No, I just there's films that they listed as fantasy that I guess they're fantasy, but I just wouldn't list them like that. Their number 10 was Big. Then they had Old School.
That's not a fantasy film. That's a family film.
Then they had the Old School, The Thief of Baghdad. Then they had Groundhog Day, Harvey, Field of Dreams, Miracle on 34th Street, King Kong, It's a Wonderful Life, and then they had Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring, and Wizard of Oz. So at least they had 2 fantasy films in there.
How the fuck is, the movie that I just can't get past the title, It's a Wonderful Life. How the fuck is that fantasy?
I would agree that's fantasy because it's based upon a magical thing. Wouldn't it be science fiction? I mean, you're basing
it's a family Christmas movie where the guy gets
it's a difference between people outside of our generation who would hear the term fantasy and what they would come up with, and then people from our generation that have been, because like Dan said, it was really the 80s on forward that we really started getting the type of fantasy film that we feel is quote unquote fantasy. When in real, at the end of the day, it's anything that's not following the rules of the natural world or anything like that. So these films technically are fantasy films. It's just not what our generation thinks of.
So you're telling me every Christmas film where someone gets knocked in the head and they never exist is a fantasy film?
Well, that's different. That's the difference between A Wonderful Life is the fact that it's not knocked in the head. It's actually that it happened. It was, angel really came down and it really let him see his life from.
So I guess Mr. Destiny is a fantasy film too, then, right?
I don't know what that is.
Mr. Destiny was with Jim Belushi. Basically,
the movies you've seen versus some of the movies you haven't seen blows my mind.
You said Jim Belushi, so I just checked out.
Oh, shut
So
up.
that was its list. We had two movies in common. I guess that's probably one of the least similar listing that we've had compared to AFI's list. But AFI,
They're weird.
they did do a science fiction one. We'll see how we run up with that one. They did not do a superhero one, so we will have nothing to compare with that one. But it will be interesting to see how similar our science fiction lists are.
Yes.
And man, I don't know. It's going to get interesting.
For the last two, for the next two episodes, the last two countdowns here in the GCR Top 10 Countdowns, we're going to be adding Steve Megatron to the sci-fi and superhero lists, and it's gonna. I guarantee you, sci-fi might destroy the Geekcast Radio Network before we even reach our 5th year anniversary.
We're not going to speak to each other after that?
Do we speak to each other now?
Sometimes.
Do you want to recap the countdown just really quick before we close this out?
Yeah, if I can remember it now that I've closed all that out. Good Lord. 10 was the second Lord of the Rings, and we had Conan the Barbarian, Highlander. What do we have after Highlander? The Labyrinth.
No, wasn't Labyrinth number 9?
No, and then we had Edward Scissorhands, and then we had Willow, and then we had Pirates, and then we had Wizard of Oz, and 2 more Lord of the Rings. And if I forgot one, I'm sorry.
All right, well, thank you for joining us here on Geekcast Radio. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Wish you'll join us next time when we will be counting down the top 10 sci-fi films. For now, I am TFU and Mike with...
Movie Revolt Dan.
And the one and only Optimus Solo.
That's only the lonely Optimus Solo.
I'll take that too.
Thank you for listening, and we will catch you next time. Be sure to unleash the geek in you.
Tell me, friend, when did Saruman the Wise abandon reason for madness?
Toto, I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore.
I'll get you, my pretty, and your little dog, too.
And think to yourself, there's no place like home. There's no place like home.
There's no place like home. There's no place like home.
You've just listened to Geekcast Radio on the Geekcast Radio Network. There are several ways to get in contact with us or leave feedback for the show. First, visit the website, geekcastradio.com, where you can comment on all of our different podcasts. Second, you can rate our show and leave us feedback in iTunes. Third, follow us on Twitter at Geekcast Radio. Fourth, become a fan on Facebook. Go to facebook.com/GeekcastRadio. Call the voicemail line 502-526-5821. Please remember to tell us the show you are leaving the message for and your name. So until next time, unleash the geek in you.